little over a decade ago, the internet went crazy over some videos that looked like science fiction. A kid barely 11 years old breaking ankles, hitting threes from another zip code, and playing like he was born for the spotlight. He wasn't just a good player for his age, he was a full-on show. You'd watch him and think, this kid is definitely going to make it to the draft. His name was Julian Newman, and if there was ever a phenomenon seemingly written to become a legend, it was him. It was impossible to escape his image. ESPN, Ball is Life, TV shows, NBA events, everyone wanted a piece of the story. He was small, quick, loud, and charismatic. The perfect mold for the viral highlight era, and as the views piled up, the message was clear: we were witnessing the future of basketball. But the story that started like a fairy tale ended up looking more like a cautionary tale. Because today, far from the NBA and even farther from the glory the internet promised him, Julian Newman is not remembered for his achievements, but for the uncomfortable question everyone tries to avoid: what happened to the kid who was supposed to take over the world? Julian Newman wasn't born with a basketball in his hand, but almost. He grew up in a household where basketball wasn't just a sport, it was a religion. His father, Jamie Newman, had never made it as a professional, but he lived as if every day was a championship final. And when he had a son, he decided that the dream he hadn't fulfilled would be pursued through Julian. From the moment the boy was strong enough to dribble the ball, the routine became almost military. No, go play in the yard for a while and we'll see. No, there was a training plan, daily goals, and zero excuses. By age 5, while other kids were just learning how to tie their shoes, Julian was already making 100 free throws, 200 floaters, and 200 jump shots a day. And it wasn't, let's see how it goes. His father was right there, correcting form, repeating drills, setting the pace like a sergeant. The entire house functioned like a mini gym, cones in the living room, balls everywhere, and a hoop waiting outside like the doorway to another life. That level of discipline began shaping not just his technique, but his character. Julian grew up with the idea that there was no room for half measures. Either you did it perfectly, or you repeated it until you got it right. Every missed shot was a correction, every mistake an opportunity to keep going. By just 6 or 7 years old, he had more training hours than many high school players. And while that made him a kid with skills far beyond his age, it also put him on a path where basketball wasn't a choice. It was his only option. The Newman name started getting known in the area, not just because the kid could play, but because everything was built around him. Family conversations, outings, even vacations revolved around tournaments, training, and games. By age 9, he was already gaining attention in Florida, going up against older kids and making them look foolish with his quick handles and deep shots. What no one imagined was that this method, so effective at building a prodigy, could also be the seed of something much more dangerous, a player built to shine very early, but who maybe wasn't ready for what came next. Julian Newman's rise to public attention wasn't gradual, it was a door being kicked wide open. Up to that point, his talent was circulating in a more or less local circuit. School leagues, a few regional tournaments, people who knew him as Coach Newman's son, the little kid who's killing it. But in 2012, at just 11 years old, that circle shattered overnight. It all started at Downey Christian School, a small private school in Florida where his father had taken a job as a teacher and coach. The move wasn't random. There, Julian could play under his guidance and, more importantly, face much older competition, and that he did. In his first season as a starter on the varsity team, yes, playing against teenagers while still in elementary school, he averaged 12.4 points, 11 assists, and 4.3 steals in his first 3 games. That year, the team finished with a 21-6 record. For a 4'5" kid, it wasn't just a good debut, it was insane. But what really lit the spark was the footage. Some grainy recordings started circulating online. A tiny kid handling the ball with video game-like control, draining deep threes, and celebrating with a swagger you'd never expect from someone his age. It was impossible not to stop and watch. His height, far from being a visual disadvantage, actually amplified the effect. Seeing him dominate players who towered over him and outweighed him by 40 pounds felt like watching a child step into a pro game and take over. Local media started to follow him, and soon the big platforms arrived. Ball is Life, Max Preps, even ESPN. Julian wasn't just a good kid for his age, he was being labeled as the best 6th grader you've ever seen. His name began spreading by word of mouth among basketball fans, coaches, and sports YouTubers. In the blink of an eye, the kid who trained at the hoop outside his house had become a sensation starting to cross state lines. The most surprising part wasn't that he played well, it was how he played. He didn't hide, didn't shy away. He went full throttle with step backs, quick crossovers, fakes, and shots that for anyone else would have been low percentage, but for him, they looked like routine. At that moment, everything pointed to us witnessing the beginning of something huge. No one was talking about peaking too early. No one imagined that the very style of play that was so flashy and effective in school could become a double-edged sword. But for now, the show was just getting started. If the debut at Downey Christian was the spark, what came next was an explosion. The following season, Julian Newman was no longer just that kid who plays against older guys. Now, he was the star of highlight reels being shared across the globe, and that's not an exaggeration. In 2012, one of his mixtapes surpassed 3.5 million views, and soon after came an even more viral one against elite prospect Kyrie Walker, where Julian dropped 52 points and the video reached over 13 million views. The most talked about moment was a game in which he scored 91 points. Yes, 91. In any category, that's a ridiculous number. In high school, and from a player his size, it felt straight out of a movie script. And while purists questioned the level of competition, the debate didn't really matter. The internet wasn't asking for context. It wanted a show, and Julian delivered. The media snowball grew at a pace neither he nor his family seemed able or willing to stop. Sports Illustrated, The New York Times, appearances on Ellen and Good Morning America, even a halftime show at an NBA game with the Orlando Magic. Every time he stepped on a court with cameras around, he knew he was building his personal brand. The kid from Florida had become a figure in sports pop culture. Part of his magnetism was that he didn't play it safe. He had a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance, pulling up from half court, dancing in front of defenders, and using body language that screamed, "This is my stage." In an era where basketball lived as much on YouTube as it did on the hardwood, that was pure gold. And to his audience, Julian wasn't just a player, he was a character. But while his image grew and his name became synonymous with basketball prodigy, one question remained buried beneath millions of likes and shares. How much of this was built for the camera, and how much was backed by a game that could survive once the lights went out? That answer, sooner or later, was going to come. As Julian entered high school, his statistical output went from merely impressive to downright historic. He broke the all-time scoring record at Florida Prep, finishing his career with over 6,200 points, the fourth highest mark in the entire history of U.S. high school basketball. He also set records for three-pointers made and assists. On paper, he was the kind of player any top-tier college would want to lock in before someone else did. But while the stat sheets looked like they'd been written by a screenwriter, something began to stand out. Scouts and recruiting websites were practically ignoring him. As other players from his class climbed up the national rankings, Julian Newman's name kept dropping lower or disappeared altogether, and that was no coincidence. Those who evaluated him in person saw a very different picture than what the videos suggested. Yes, there was talent, but also clear physical limitations. His height, somewhere between 5 feet 5 inches and 5 feet 7 inches, put him at a disadvantage against taller, more athletic opponents. And his style, built for highlight reels, didn't always translate into real game efficiency. Flashy plays, impossible shots, and slick dribbling looked incredible on camera, but often didn't help win games against high-level competition. At that point, the conversation began to shift. It was no longer about whether Julian would be the next big star, but whether his game was truly ready for the leap to a stage where competition wasn't measured in views, but in wins. The media machine kept turning, but for the first time, cracks were starting to show. And those cracks, though small at first, would soon become fractures too big to hide. At that point, with the fame still burning but real interest from major colleges in doubt, the Newman family decided that if the system wasn't going to give Julian the stage they wanted, they would build one themselves. That's how Prodigy Prep was born, a basketball program created by and for him. Literally, the school, the team, the schedule, and even the style of play were all designed so Julian could be the absolute star without anyone setting limits or taking the spotlight away. It was an ambitious, almost cinematic move. Instead of adapting to an existing program, they built one where he was the center of the universe. That meant total control over the narrative, choosing opponents that guaranteed a good show, and keeping the Julian Newman brand alive on social media. On paper, it sounded like the perfect platform to end his high school career with a bang and regain the attention of recruiters. But there was one problem. Isolating yourself from top-tier competition is like training in a bubble. You can feel invincible, but until you go out and face the best, you don't really know where you stand. At Prodigy Prep, Julian could play with complete freedom, force shots, endless dribbles, plays made for the camera. And since the team was built around him being the first and last offensive option, his stats stayed high. But the true barometer, performance against elite opponents, was pushed to the background. The risk with that strategy is that high-level basketball doesn't forgive. Colleges and scouts aren't impressed by a well-edited mixtape if they know the schedule was built to avoid the Giants, and at some point that bubble was going to crash into reality. When that happened, all the lights, views, and record-breaking numbers wouldn't serve as a shield, and that moment, even if no one said it out loud, was getting closer and closer. This wasn't just another game on the schedule. From the moment the matchup was confirmed, social media lit up Julian Newman versus LaMelo Ball. Two internet sensations, two opposing styles, two paths that sooner or later were bound to cross. In one corner, Julian, perfecting his game for the spotlight in a setting designed around him. In the other, LaMelo, who at the same age had already experienced professional basketball in Lithuania and Australia, facing grown men who weren't going to be dazzled by flashy dribbling. The hype was cinematic. Fans debated in forums, highlight channels promised full coverage, and even some media outlets billed it as the ultimate clash of viral prodigies. For Julian, it was the chance to prove that he wasn't just dominating in his bubble, but could also compete against another big name in youth basketball, one who also understood the weight of the cameras but came from a much tougher environment. From the opening tip, the contrast was obvious. LaMelo played with surgical control, setting the tempo, spacing the floor, finding teammates at exactly the right moment. It was like he had the game in slow motion, reading it 2 plays ahead. Julian, on the other hand, was rushed, forcing step backs and one-on-one plays, chasing the spectacular move instead of the right one. The spin moves that had earned him millions of views on YouTube now ended in defenses that had seen them 1,000 times and were waiting for them at every angle. The final score wasn't a historic blowout, but the narrative was. LaMelo finished with a near effortless triple-double, and the highlights shared after the game weren't of Julian, not a single one. The pages that once fought to post his clips were now editing compilations of LaMelo's passes and shots. That shift in focus had consequences. Among coaches and scouts, the game was read as a test Julian didn't pass. It wasn't that he had stopped being talented, but the gap between a prospect ready for the next level and one stuck in highlight mode was now impossible to ignore. The hype was still there, sure, but the real belief in his upside took a step back. And while for most people it was just another game, for him it marked a turning point the moment it became clear that the era of winning with mixtapes was coming to an end. If the game against LaMelo had been a hit to the ego, the matchup with IMG Academy was a full-speed collision with a reinforced concrete wall. And not just any wall, IMG isn't just a school, it's a factory for elite athletes, a program where some of the best basketball, football, and tennis prospects on the planet train and study. When Prodigy Prep added them to the schedule, it wasn't a typical high school showdown. It was a team built around Julian facing an unofficial national squad stacked with 4- and 5-star players, all with college-level size, athleticism, and talent. From the moment the ball was in the air, the difference was obvious. IMG played with an intensity Prodigy Prep had never faced before. Every pass, every shot, every dribble attempt by Julian ran into hands, arms, and bodies ready to shut him down. The plays that usually ended in viral buckets turned into steals, blocks, and fast breaks going the other way. Julian kept trying his usual repertoire, step backs, deep threes, endless dribbles, but this time every move looked slower, more predictable, easier to read. The result was brutal, a 60-point loss. This wasn't just a bad night, it was a clear sign that against top-tier physical and technical competition, the system built around Julian couldn't hold. The entire Prodigy Prep team looked outmatched, but the spotlight was on him. On camera, the frustration was visible. Gestures, arguments, and at one point even a chair flying during the game. It was the kind of reaction that reinforced a growing perception that beyond the talent, there was a lack of ability to adapt and lead under pressure. And the harshest part came afterward. IMG didn't need a special defensive plan to stop him. All it took was the same discipline they apply to any serious prospect. For scouts, that was almost a verdict. If a player needs the entire context to be tailored in his favor to shine, then he's not ready for the next level. That day was more than a loss, it was a diagnosis. Prodigy Prep could manufacture stats and mixtapes, but it couldn't manufacture real experience against elite opponents. And Julian, for the first time, was fully exposed in front of the world. No editing, no cuts, no slow motion to save him. For years, one of the points keeping the story around Julian Newman alive was the supposed line of Division I universities interested in him. His father talked about up to 15 offers on the table, all waiting for the moment to decide. For the audience following him since he was 11, it sounded like confirmation that, despite the criticism, the system was still betting on him. But when you look closer, that story began to unravel. None of those offers were made public. No renowned university announced formal interest, and in the recruiting world, where any approach to a high-profile prospect leaks on social media within hours, that silence was suspicious. For many, the offers were more a narrative device than a tangible reality. Over time, Julian himself lowered the tone. He no longer talked about going to the NCAA, but about an alternative plan, skipping college and developing his career abroad. Germany, Italy, China, Australia, even the G League appeared on the list of possible destinations. Officially, it was a strategic move to get to the NBA faster. Unofficially, it was a way to to avoid admitting that the doors that were supposed to be open were never fully open. The problem was that this alternate plan didn't materialize either. There were no contracts in Europe, nor concrete offers in minor leagues in the United States. Meanwhile, the generation he had grown up with kept advancing. Some were already in the draft, others at top universities, and he kept orbiting around his own name without a high-level team backing him. What was once a hook to maintain expectation became an uncomfortable reminder. Genuine interest from elite programs isn't bought with views or isolated records. It's earned against real opponents in arenas where there's no room for marketing, and that was a test Julian still hadn't passed. If there was one thing clear to anyone following Julian Newman's career closely, it was that his game, as flashy as it was, wasn't evolving. At first glance, he was still the same kid who conquered the internet at 11. Same spectacular dribble, same forced step backs, same chest shot mechanics with a low release. Only now, he wasn't facing average high school kids, but athletes taller, faster, and much more physical. His height, between 5 feet 5 inches and 5 feet 7 inches, wasn't an insurmountable obstacle by itself. Basketball history has examples of small players who left a mark, from Muggsy Bogues to Isaiah Thomas, but they all had something in common: explosiveness, quick first step, the ability to absorb contact and finish at the rim against much bigger opponents. Julian didn't have that physical package. He didn't jump high enough, didn't explode quickly enough, and couldn't finish consistently in the paint when outmatched in height and weight. Adding to that was his style of play. His offensive plan seemed made for highlights, long dribble sequences, very deep three-pointers, exaggerated fakes. When they worked, they looked spectacular, but most of the time they weren't the best option for the team. He didn't exploit simpler spaces, didn't seek easy cuts, and his shot selection often left him with low percentages. Against well-set defenses, his dribble didn't create enough separation for a comfortable shot. Even his passing, once seen as a strong point, began to lose weight, largely because opponents already knew he wasn't a real threat driving and then passing. If they stopped him on the perimeter, they took away much of his repertoire. His assists in the Prodigy prep system were more a product of the team design than of high-level reads. In short, Julian had perfected a type of basketball that worked in mixtapes but didn't survive against real opponents. And while his peers grew, adapted, and added tools, he seemed frozen in the version of himself that made him famous, as if time passed for everyone but his game. In basketball, talent opens doors, but attitude decides whether those doors stay open. And in the case of Julian Newman, as his game stopped impressing, his behavior started taking up more space in the conversation. What was once interpreted as confidence gradually began to look more like ego. What on social media seemed like swagger and personality was, for many coaches and teammates, simply a problem. In high-profile games, when things didn't go his way, it was common to see him frustrated. Gestures at referees, arguments with opponents, exaggerated reactions. The most memorable episode came in that game against IMG Academy, where he ended up throwing a chair during the match, an image that went viral more as a meme than a competitive moment. There were reports of fights in practice, clashes with teammates, and even rumors of locker room tension, which, although never publicly confirmed, didn't help his reputation. In a sport where the word coachable is almost a prerequisite for advancement, Julian began carrying the opposite label. Coaches and scouts saw him as a difficult player to manage, unwilling to adapt his game to a collective system. And if a prospect already raises concerns physically and technically, adding the perception that he's uncoachable is for most college or professional programs a red flag that tells them to move on. The irony is that part of that same personality is what made him famous. The competitive fire that had him celebrating impossible threes at age 12 eventually turned into a trait that worked against him. Because on courts where a highlight was no longer enough to impress, what people paid most attention to wasn't his mixtape. It was how he reacted when he was losing, and the answer rarely convinced anyone. After all the viral clips, the records, and the promise of an NBA future, Julian Newman's destiny wasn't an ESPN announcement or a signing with a professional team. His real jump came quietly years later on a stage few would have imagined. At 23 years old, he finally made his college basketball debut, but not at Duke, Kentucky, or Gonzaga, not even in a Division I program. It happened at Bethesda University, an institution so small that it's not even officially affiliated with the NCAA. In theory, it was a chance to rewrite the narrative, a fresh start, far from the pressure of the spotlight. But what was seen on the court told a different story. In just 4 games, he averaged 3 points per game with a 12% field goal percentage, 0 for 7 from three-point range, and 33% from the free throw line. There were no double-digit games, no performances reminiscent of the Prodigy, who once dropped 91 points. And the most devastating part wasn't his individual stat, it was the context. Bethesda lost those games by an average of 53 points. There were losses by 60, even 69. On several occasions, Julian looked disconnected from the game, forcing impossible shots as if he were still at Prodigy prep, but without the advantage of being the protected star of the team. Against college players, even if they weren't elite, the physical, tactical, and mental gap was massive. That brief stint wasn't the beginning of a comeback, but the confirmation of what many had feared for years, that the skills which made him famous online had not turned into a game built to withstand serious levels of competition. There was no last-minute scouting, no saving phone call. In just a few weeks, the myth of the prodigy collapsed completely, exposing an uncomfortable truth. The Julian Newman era as a prospect was over, and it had ended without a glorious finale, just with a silence that brutally contrasted with the noise it had all begun with. After the brief and disastrous stint at Bethesda University, Julian Newman fell off the competitive radar. There were no serious college offers, no overseas contracts, not even concrete opportunities in lower-tier US leagues. What remained was his name, still recognized by those who had watched him break ankles on YouTube a decade earlier, and a personal brand trying to survive without any backing on the court. In the years that followed, his presence shifted almost entirely to the digital realm. He remained active on social media, posting workouts, challenging strangers and known names to a series, Beat Julian Newman, a one-on-one format recorded and designed to keep racking up viral clips. Rumors even circulated that Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, might help him get a G League tryout. But like so many other promises in his career that never materialized, meanwhile, his generation moved on. Many of the names he once shared headlines with in high school were now playing at top universities, in the NBA, or in elite international leagues. Julian, meanwhile, existed in a strange space, too famous to be unknown, yet without recent merit to be taken seriously as a prospect. The image of the child prodigy still sparked curiosity, but with each passing year, the interest faded a bit more. It's the point many viral phenomena reach once their moment passes. They remain trapped in the shadow of what they once were. Julian could keep training, posting videos, and talking about a future in basketball, but the gap between his words and his actual competitive standing became impossible to ignore. And in that space, between what was promised and what was truly delivered, his story started to become more than just a career. It turned into a reminder of how quickly the internet can elevate and forget. Some stories are built on victories and trophies, others live on in memory because of what they made people feel at the time. Julian Newman's story belongs to the latter. No matter how much his present has changed, for those who saw him at 11 years old breaking down defenses and hitting impossible threes, that memory remains untouched, like a time capsule that can't be erased. What remains is a paradox. For a brief moment, he was the center of the youth basketball universe, a symbol of what social media could do with precocious talent. But the same megaphone that propelled him forward ended up amplifying every stumble along the way, and now, when his name surfaces, it's not to discuss recent achievements, it's to remember a phenomenon that once seemed destined for the top and faded before ever getting there. Perhaps that's why his story still draws interest, because it leaves us wondering what was real and what was a product of the moment. Whether he ever truly had the potential to fulfill the promise, or whether from the very beginning, we were only witnessing the most edited, most spectacular version of something that was never built to last in the real world. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.